So, Daniel chapter 9, and we're kind of finishing up a passage that I wound up breaking into three sections for the sake of making it manageable. So we'll begin reading in the middle of verse 26 and also read verse 27. It says, "And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city," that's Jerusalem, "and the sanctuary," that's the temple. "Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolators." Now, before we get into this section, I want to review the previous verses, going back to verse 24, because I'm going to try to tie it all together tonight. This is one passage, 24 through 27, that I've broken into three parts. So 2 weeks ago we looked at verse 24, and I explained why I believe it's the Messiah, Jesus. So let's just read it again. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Again, I won't go through all the details tonight, but we did an entire lesson on why I believe that's talking about Jesus. And then we went to verse 25 and the first part of verse 26, and it says this: "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing." So again, now in my view, this is talking about the decree made by Cyrus, the king of Persia, to rebuild Jerusalem. And Daniel is told here by the angel Gabriel that 62 weeks, and I explained that 1 week is, we think, the equivalent of 7 years, so it would be 434 years. 62 weeks would elapse between the time Cyrus issued this decree and the death of Jesus. And again, I'm not going to go through all that again because that was an entire lesson last time. And so now we're getting into the middle of verse 26 and also verse 27, and I think it's about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. Now, before we get into that, I want to repeat something I've been saying for the past few weeks, the past few days, starting Monday morning. I have done a lot of reading on this passage from scholars that I respect. Some of them agree with me, or should I say I agree with them, and some of them disagree with me. And so what I'm going to give you tonight is my perspective. But I am not speaking for anybody but me. And as always, you are responsible to make up your own mind as to whether or not you agree with me. And if you disagree, that's fine. This is my perspective. This is how I see it. And there are questions that I am not able to answer, even as much study as I've done. There are flaws in my argument that I've seen. I won't get into them for the sake of time tonight. Maybe next week, I don't know. But I found that with every perspective. This is a complicated passage, and nobody is able to resolve every little detail. So let's read the text again, and then we'll go through it. Daniel 26 and 27, "After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood." Now, I don't believe that's a literal flood. I mean, that's talking about a sudden onslaught of events, a flood of activity, so to speak. "And to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed." In other words, tremendous destruction. That's what that word means. "And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." So, in my view, these verses are describing two separate individuals. In verse 26, it talks about an anointed one, and that, again, I believe is a reference to the Messiah, and Gabriel's describing his death. An anointed one shall be cut off, verse 26, and shall have nothing. So I think that's a description of Jesus. But then you get into the second part of verse 26, and it says this anointed one is followed by a prince. That's the word in Hebrew too. And this individual is going to destroy the city of Jerusalem, it says, and the sanctuary, which is another word to describe the temple. And it also says this person is going to make a covenant with many, but for half of the covenant, he's going to bring an end to sacrifices and offerings, which of course would be a reference then to the Jewish worship system in the temple, that he would prevent it from happening. Now, I want to kind of just very quickly show you what I grew up believing, and a lot of people that I respect, scholars, still believe this. Just so you know, this is the more traditional view in at least Assemblies of God churches. A lot of people, scholars, say that these events here take place in the future. So they divide. There's a total of 70 weeks, right, back and going all the way to verse 24, and they see an interval, a long interval between the end of the 69th week, 483 years, and then the 70th week. So they said there's 69 weeks, 483 years, then there's a long, long time, and then there's this final week, the final 7-year period, and they say we're in that interval right now, and it's the age of the church, okay? Jesus and his ministry, day of Pentecost, and that's where we're living now. And so the way they view, and again, I grew up being taught this, and I can see a lot of value in this. They say that once the church age is completed, in other words, Jesus returns, then that's the church age will be finished, and then the Antichrist comes on the scene. And I'm cutting out a lot of the details. I'm just giving you the basic core. And part of what the Antichrist will do during that time, he will attack Jerusalem and the temple, which will have been rebuilt by then. They say he will destroy that. And again, I keep repeating myself, but this is important that you hear this. This is the view that I was taught most of my life. And I was really into prophecy when I was younger. And I have a lot of respect for those who teach this view. And I'm not saying for sure that they're wrong. I'm just saying that over the years I've come to see it differently. So here's what I believe, and then I'm going to try to make a case for it. I believe that these verses, the end of verse 26 and also verse 27, I think this refers to when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and in particular they destroyed the temple because they were punishing the Jewish people for their rebellion against Roman authority. Now I'm going to go into some history now here and show you where I've come up with this. It started with a man named, I'm not very good at the Latin here. I don't know if it's Gessius Florus or Gessius. I think it's Gessius. I think it's a hard G. Anyway, this man he did some things, and his actions caused what historians call the first Jewish revolt. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He was the Roman governor. The real title was procurator, but he was the Roman governor over Judea. So that's basically Israel. Only when the Romans controlled it, it was just a province in their empire. They called it Judea. And Gessius Florus was the Roman governor over Judea for 3 years. He came into office in AD 64, and he continued through AD 66. Now, he was not a popular governor among the Jews because he was known as being biased or partial toward Gentiles. So if there was a Jewish person and a Gentile person in a court case that he was deciding, he pretty much would decide in favor of the Gentile because he just didn't like Jewish people. And so they were already kind of chafing under his leadership. The Jews were, this was their land, and here's this anti-Jewish person in charge of things. They didn't like him, but nothing severe had happened yet. There was just this feeling of being unhappy. But then there came a moment in his reign when he was running low on funds. He had a treasury that he had control of through taxation and also other income streams. And he was running low on funds, and so he knew that in the temple, a lot of people deposited money. Essentially, it functioned as sort of a bank. People could store their money there, Jewish people, and could get it out when they needed it. And so he basically raided the temple, sent some soldiers in, and he took 17 talents of silver. So I looked it up, 17 talents. it works out to 1,275 pounds. That's a lot of silver. He went into the temple treasury. They had a room where they stored this money, and he took it for his own needs. Now, it's one thing to rob people. They get angry enough. But when you rob their house of worship, there's a whole new level of anger, right? And so there was an uproar among the Jews. They started to, depending on who you read, which historians, they started to riot. There started to be some unrest. And so in response, Gessius sent soldiers into the heart of Jerusalem where the worst of the unrest was happening. And the reports of that day estimate that these soldiers killed about 3,600 people and wounded many, many more. And that began the first Jewish revolt. When people heard what he had done, they began to organize themselves into kind of like paramilitary groups, and they would actually have running battles against Roman soldiers. And there were tens of thousands of Jewish men who armed themselves, and they were living out in the desert, in the countryside, in the mountains, and they would come in on raiding parties and attack the Romans. And it's interesting that the Romans were pretty much thought of as being impregnable. I mean, they were one of the greatest armies ever, perhaps given their technology, the greatest army ever, given the technology they had. And they could not defeat these Jews because the Jews fought these battles a little bit like the American Revolution. They would kind of come in, attack, and then melt away, and wouldn't stand and fight in a pitched battle because they knew the Romans were better trained and better armed. And so there were two different Roman generals. Again, I'm cutting the history into a shorter version here just for the sake of time, that actually came in and led their armies against the Jews. Neither one of them could defeat the Jews. In one time, a general died, or somebody, maybe I think it was an emperor, died, and he was recalled. But these two generals and their armies couldn't do it until a man named Titus, who would later become one of the emperors of Rome. Titus and his army came into Judea and began to just decimate people. And they attacked Jerusalem and killed tens of thousands of people. And they destroyed the temple. And that happened in 70 AD. And that, even to this day, in the Jewish calendar, this is a day of mourning. People still talk about this. And it's a big, big deal in Jewish history. So kind of just hold that thought in the back of your minds. 70 AD, Titus, and then Gessius, and all this going on. And I want to go back now to what we've been seeing in Daniel. Now remember what I said. Most biblical scholars believe that each week in Daniel here in this passage represents a seven-year period. And at the beginning of our passage, it talked about 70 weeks are decreed. Okay? And it divides it into three periods. There's the first period of seven weeks, which would be 49 years. We talked about that. Then there's that 62-week period. We talked about that last week. And then you have this final 1 week. So 2 weeks ago and last week, I tried to account for 69 weeks and what was happening in that time. Not repeating that again because you don't have time tonight. Not going to go through it all. But I want to focus on this last week. The last week in the 70 weeks. One period of 7 years. And here's the question I want to ask you. Did this Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple fit into a time frame of 7 years? Okay? So now I want to kind of go back through our timeline. If you remember, I think it's on your outline, I'm sure it is. Gessius Florus becomes governor of Judea in AD 64. Okay? And it culminates, this period of conflict, it culminates when the army of Titus defeats Jerusalem and destroys the temple in AD 70. So you got a problem because the way we figure dates, that's 6 years, right? 64 through 70 is 6 years. But what you have to remember is this. Jewish people did their calculations of dates differently. They included the first year as one of the numbers. So we figure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. 6 years. This is how Jews figured it. 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. 7 years. That's how Jews did their calculating. Same thing with the death of Jesus. We talk about, well, Jesus didn't die 3 days, or didn't rise again 3 days after. Well, in the Jewish way of doing time, he did. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday wasn't 2 days later. In their thinking, it was 3 days. Same principle. So it fits the 7-year time frame, and it was in the middle of the 7-year period, specifically AD 66, when Gessius Florus broke the peace that he had tried to maintain with the Jews because they were unhappy with what he had done, stealing that money. And he sent his soldiers into Jerusalem. And part of what they did in that time was forbid the Jews to use the temple for their worship. Let's go back to the first part of verse 27. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. Which pretty much lines up. It was about the middle of that 7-year period when he ordered no more Jews using the temple for worship. Fits with verse 27. And then this conflict, this 7-year period of conflict, comes to an end roughly 3.5 years later when Titus and his soldiers broke through the walls of Jerusalem and they began killing people by the thousands. And then they finally reached the temple itself and break through the walls. And there's a big debate over whether Titus tried to stop the soldiers or whether he wanted them to do it. But whatever it was, they burned the temple to the ground to where nothing was left except rubble. They smashed it up as much as they could, burned it, carried off everything. And that would fit with kind of the end of verse 27. On the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, as I said, I have missed some things here because I can't explain everything in this passage. I just can't. And I've gotten some details wrong because no one knows it all except the Lord, and he doesn't tell me. But I think I've been able to make an argument that my perspective on what happened here fits with the timeline that Gabriel gave to Daniel. And so overall, when it comes to figuring out what this part of Daniel in chapter 9 means, I think that I'm at least close. One of the biggest differences between my perspective and what a lot of Christians believe, including my dad, he sees this very, very differently. He's a man I respect greatly because he studies the Bible like I've never seen. He would say, and many like him would say, a lot of people believe that the Jerusalem temple will be rebuilt by the Antichrist. Some of you probably believe that, and I believe that for years. Whereas from my perspective, I don't see it happening. I'm not saying it won't happen. I just don't expect it. And one of the reasons I say that is because when you look closely at the overall flow of these verses in Daniel 9, I don't see the need for it. Let me explain, okay? Remember what I said. Verse 24 is about the ministry of the Messiah. It's about Jesus. Spent a whole lesson talking about that. And then verse 25 and the first part of verse 26, that's all leading up to the death of Jesus on the cross. So Messiah Jesus, that's the context. Verses 24, 25, first part of verse 26, it's all about Jesus. And if I'm right about this, then that tells us that the whole passage is centered on Jesus. He's the context. And if you know anything about me and the way I interpret the Bible, whenever it comes to interpretation, context determines meaning. So I don't see a necessity for a change here. Now, let me continue. That's why, because it's all about Jesus, that's why I do not see the necessity of the temple being rebuilt in the end times. Daniel wanted it to happen, of course, right? Daniel's in Babylon. He's thinking about Jerusalem. He knows the temple's destroyed. He wants God's people to be free of Babylon. He wants to see the temple rebuilt so worship can be restored. That happened. Remember? 49 weeks? Or the 7 weeks, the 49 years. So the temple was rebuilt. But you remember what I said about 3-4 weeks ago? Prophecy is also often built on multiple levels. It's like a mountain, right? mountain 1, mountain 2, mountain 3. The prophet's here, he can only see the first mountain because it covers up the second mountain behind it. And so I think Daniel saw the temple being rebuilt back then, but I don't know that it's necessary for it to be rebuilt again, because there's multiple levels. So let's go walk through this. We know the temple was rebuilt the first time after Daniel saw this because Cyrus gave the order. That's in 2 Chronicles 36, 22 and 23. I won't read it, but it's in your outline. We talked about it last time. That's the temple that was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Now, here's where I get controversial, and I've already said this. I'm not convinced that the physical temple in Jerusalem needs to be rebuilt again to fulfill prophecy, because I think the second level of Daniel's prophecy, the second mountain, if you want to say it, is showing us that Jesus takes the place of the temple. Remember what I've been saying. Context determines meaning, and the context of Daniel 9, 24 through 27 is Jesus. It's the Messiah. So I think that what's happening after the first temple is rebuilt, which Daniel did foresee, God's ultimate purpose in salvation, his bigger purpose, is not a physical temple with a most holy place where the priest can only enter once a year. There's something else we see in the New Testament, which is this. Jesus has now become the way for people to approach God. Not a temple, not a sacrifice system. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is the only way for sin to be forgiven. So that's why I don't see the temple being rebuilt. Now, there are passages in other books that seem to describe that. I think they are spiritual allegories talking about Jesus and his ministry, but I could be wrong. But I simply come down with this. The temple and the sacrifice system represented the old way of doing things. It represented the past. But Jesus represents God's plan for salvation today. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the only way to God. And so I don't see why why God would want another Jewish temple to be built. I could be wrong, and I admit that. I could be very wrong, but I simply don't see it. And it's not just me who says that. I think you can make a pretty good case that Jesus himself had the same perspective, and I'll leave his words with you, John 2, verses 18 through 22. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple." Now he's standing by the temple in Jerusalem. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. And I think that was a hint, a foreshadowing of things that were to come, because it wouldn't be too long after this that the actual temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed by Titus, and Jesus becomes that temple. He's the only way that we can be saved. So, again, repeating myself endlessly to the point where you're sick of hearing it, I could be wrong. I know that. And that's why we have discussion time, because you may have a different perspective, and I am not going to try to shut anybody down and argue with you. Hopefully I won't. But that's part of why we have the discussion time, so we can have different perspectives, because, again, most of my life I felt differently. This has probably been the last 10, 15 years that I've begun to change my perspective. But if you think differently, it'd be interesting to hear that, or if you agree, or if you have questions, and I won't be able to answer all of them, I know, because I'm not an expert in this. But now you know what I believe, and we'll let you guys talk about it, okay?